He said it with a smile. Not a cruel smile, exactly, something worse than that. The kind of smile that lives on the face of someone who has already decided how the story ends and finds the whole thing mildly entertaining. We were sitting across from each other in a conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown building, our respective lawyers beside us like chess pieces. And my husband of 11 years looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something charmingly naive. "You'll get nothing," Derek said. "You signed the prenup. You knew what it meant." He wasn't wrong about the prenup. I had signed it at 26, in love and inexperienced and quietly afraid that if I pushed back too hard, I would lose him. What I had not known at 26, what nobody tells you when you are young and in love and ignoring the architecture of your own future, is that a prenup signed under emotional pressure, without independent legal counsel, without full asset disclosure, is not necessarily the immovable wall the person who drafted it wants you to believe it is. But I didn't know that yet, sitting in that conference room. What I knew, in that exact moment, was the weight of 11 years of my life condensed into a single casual smile on a man who had already moved on before he had the decency to tell me he was leaving. I looked down at my hands. My lawyer touched my arm. And then my phone buzzed with a notification I almost didn't read, a message from an estate attorney in Mill Haven, 3 hours north, informing me that my grandfather, Walter Pruitt, had passed away 6 days ago, and that I was the sole beneficiary of his estate. His estate, the message clarified, consisted primarily of a fishing cabin on Lake Aldrin, assessed by the county at a value of $7. Derek's lawyer leaned over and whispered something to him. Derek glanced at his phone. He laughed, actually laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and said, "A $7 cabin. That's perfect." I didn't laugh. I was already thinking. Let me tell you who I was before Derek, because that woman matters, and she got buried so gradually that I barely noticed the excavation until it was complete. My name is June Pruitt Calloway. Before the Calloway, I was just June Pruitt, granddaughter of Walter Pruitt, who fished the same lake for 60 years and called it his religion. I grew up in a mid-sized city in Ohio, middle class in the specific way that means your parents worked constantly and loved you genuinely and had approximately nothing left over. I was smart. I got a partial scholarship to a decent university, studied communications, graduated with a 3.7 GPA and roughly $40,000 in student debt that I serviced with a job at a mid-level marketing firm. I was competent, driven, and utterly unprepared for someone like Derek Calloway. Derek was the kind of man whose confidence entered a room before he did. He was handsome in an architectural way, everything placed precisely, and he came from the kind of family where money was not discussed because it was assumed, the way oxygen is assumed. He found me at a work event. He pursued me with a focus that I mistook for devotion. We were engaged within 14 months, married in a ceremony I didn't entirely plan but smiled through completely. His family money was substantial. Old industry wealth, diversified into real estate and investment portfolios over 3 generations. When I married Derek, I stepped into a life that operated on a scale I had never inhabited, the right neighborhood, the right social events, the right clothes. Derek liked that I was polished but not from his world. I understood later, a choice he made because I was grateful enough to be manageable. I spent the first 3 years of our marriage building his company's brand communications department from a 2-person team to a 12-person operation. I did it without a formal title, without a salary, because we had agreed that I would be compensated through our shared life, through the assets we built together. Derek made the money. I built the infrastructure that helped him make more of it. Then, year 7, something shifted in him. Slowly at first, like a tide going out, small withdrawals of warmth, increasing absences, a new quality of impatience when I spoke. By year 9, I had diagnosed the problem clearly but told myself it was a phase, a stressful period, something we could work through. By year 11, I caught him at a charity gala talking to a woman named Simone with the specific quality of attention he had once reserved entirely for me. I filed 3 weeks later. He seemed almost relieved. The prenup he had drafted covered everything, the house, the investment accounts, the business assets, the vacation property in Vermont. Everything acquired during our marriage that was technically his was contractual his. I had contributed 11 years of strategic thinking, social management, and brand development, but I had not contributed documented, compensated labor. I had been, in legal terms, a spouse. And the prenup defined what spouses were entitled to, which was a fixed sum, a settlement that sounded significant until you set it against 11 years of cost of living at a certain altitude. Grandpa Walter had died 6 days before that conference room. I hadn't known. We had not been close in recent years, distance, both geographical and the subtle social pressure Derek applied around family he deemed unrefined. Walter was a man who wore the same canvas jacket for 15 years and kept a coffee can of fishing lures on his kitchen counter and had absolutely no patience for people who talked about money as though it were a personality. Derek had made his opinion of my grandfather clear through tone alone, and I, to my lasting shame, had let those visits become rare. Now Walter was gone. And I had inherited a $7 cabin. I drove to Millhaven the following morning. Not because I expected anything. Because I needed to be somewhere that had nothing to do with Derek Calloway. The estate attorney's name was Frank Heller, and he operated out of a 2-room office above a hardware store on Millhaven's Main Street. He was 70, approximately, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful manner of a man who had spent decades managing the affairs of people who were more complicated than they appeared. He shook my hand when I arrived. He offered coffee. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Before we go through the documents, he said, I want to say something that isn't strictly legal in nature. I told him to go ahead. Your grandfather talked about you, Frank said. Frequently, and specifically. He talked about the girl who used to sit on the dock with him at 4:30 in the morning and not say a word for an hour and be perfectly content. He said that was the rarest quality a person could have. He paused. He also said he was sorry the years had gotten away from you both. He wanted me to make sure you understood that. I looked at the coffee cup in my hands. What am I actually inheriting? I asked, because I needed to move forward before I came apart. Frank opened the folder on his desk. The cabin at Lake Aldrin, he confirmed, was assessed by Millhaven County at a value of $7, a figure that reflected a quirk of rural property assessment, outdated infrastructure records, and a classification that hadn't been updated since 1987. The assessed value was, in every practical sense, fictional. However, the cabin sat on 4 acres of lakefront land. The land itself, assessed separately, classified under a different county designation, held in a distinct title, had not been part of the estate summary documentation forwarded to the divorce proceedings. It had its own deed, its own filing history, its own, considerably different, value. Frank slid a document across the desk. A property appraisal, conducted 8 months ago by a certified real estate firm, at Walter's specific request. The 4 acres of Lake Aldrin frontage, pristine, undeveloped, sitting on one of the most sought-after recreational lakes in the state. In a county where lakefront land had tripled in value over the previous decade, appraised at $2.3 million. Additionally, Frank said, adjusting his glasses, Walter had maintained a separate investment account in his own name for 40 years. Modest contributions, consistent returns, left entirely untouched. The account, which had been rolled into the estate and was not mentioned in the forwarded summary, held $890,000. I set down the coffee cup. The total estate value, Frank said, is approximately $3.2 million. The room was very quiet. He assessed the cabin at $7 on purpose, I said. Frank smiled. It was a different kind of smile than Derek's. This one had warmth in it, and patience. Walter Pruitt was a very deliberate man, he said. He had been following your situation, at a distance, without involving himself, because he said it wasn't his place to interfere in your marriage. But when it became clear that interference was unnecessary, he made some arrangements. A pause. He also consulted, at some length, with a colleague of mine who specializes in matrimonial law. Walter had known about the prenup. He had structured the estate document specifically so that the significant assets would not appear in any summary forwarded to opposing counsel. By the time Derek's lawyers thought to look, the inheritance would already be legally processed and entirely protected. My grandfather had outmaneuvered an army of corporate attorneys from a fishing cabin with a coffee can of Lear's on the kitchen counter. I asked Frank if I could have a moment. He found something to attend to in the adjacent room. I drove to Lake Aldrin that afternoon. 3 hours north on a 2-lane highway that moved through small towns and open country and, eventually, into the kind of landscape that requires something to slow down in you before you can properly see it, dense second-growth forest pulling back to reveal the lake in sections. Blue and silver and wide, the November sky above it enormous and still. I hadn't been here in 4 years. The last time, Derek had come reluctantly and spent 2 days on his phone in the car and said, driving away, that he genuinely couldn't understand why anyone would choose this over literally anywhere else. I had laughed it off. I had agreed that we should take better vacations, more interesting ones, somewhere with a spa. I thought about that now. About the slow erosion of things I had loved, replaced so gradually and with such good reasons that I had not identified the pattern until the pattern was the shape of my entire life. The road to the cabin turned to gravel and then to packed dirt. Bare birch trees lined it on both sides, their white trunks pale in the late afternoon light. I could smell the lake before I saw the cabin, cold water, pine, the particular clarity of air that has not been processed through concrete and glass. The cabin itself was small and weathered and completely, unreservedly itself. The porch sagged slightly on the left side. The shutters were painted blue, the same blue they had been when I was 7 years old, though faded now to something softer. There was a split-log woodpile stacked against the eastern wall with the precision of someone who had been doing it the same way for 60 years and saw no reason to change. I sat in my car for a while. Not because I was afraid to go in. Because I needed to feel the weight of this moment before I moved through it, the specific gravity of arriving somewhere you have been missing without knowing you were missing it. I went inside. The smell hit me immediately, wood smoke and coffee and something underneath both that I cannot name precisely but that I associate entirely with safety. The stove. The cast iron pan hanging on its hook. The 2 chairs angled toward the window that faced the lake. The coffee can of Lear's, exactly where it had always been, on the kitchen counter, wearing a small handwritten label that said Walter's Favorites in my grandfather's capital letter print. I put my hands on the counter. I stood there for a long time. Then I noticed the envelope, propped against the coffee can, with my name on it. It was a long letter. 7 pages, handwritten on legal pad paper, written over what must have been several sittings. I could tell because the handwriting varied slightly, looser in some sections, more careful in others. The way writing does when the writer returns to it after sleep or thought or the particular physical fatigue of age. Walter had written it 6 months before he died. He began by telling me about the cabin, which he had purchased for $7,000 in 1963 from a man named Orchard who was moving west and needed the cash quickly. He wrote about the lake the way some people write about people they love, with specificity and patience, noting the way the morning light moved across it in each season. The spots where the largemouth bass held in summer, the particular quality of the ice in January. He had been coming here for 60 years, he wrote, and it still surprised him sometimes. Then he shifted. He wrote about my mother, his daughter, and the way she had brought me here as a small child. And how he had watched me take to the water and the quiet with an ease that told him something important about who I was built to be. He wrote about missing the years that had accumulated between us, and about how he had made a decision early in my marriage to trust that I was finding my own path even when the path worried him. He wrote about Derek. Carefully, without cruelty, but honestly. I met that man twice, Walter wrote, and both times he looked at this place the way some men look at things they consider beneath them. That would have been his business and none of mine, except that I could see he looked at you the same way sometimes, and that became my business, even if I kept it to myself. He wrote about the property. About the land assessment, about Frank Heller, about the years he had spent quietly building the investment account that he had always intended for me, beginning the year I was born. He explained, in straightforward language, that he had consulted with lawyers about how to ensure that his intentions for me would survive any legal situation that might arise. And that he was satisfied he had structured things accordingly. Then, near the end of the letter, he wrote something that undid me completely. "There is something in the coffee can that isn't a law." I looked at the can. I reached inside, past the feathered hooks and the worn metal spinners and the rubber worms in their compartments. At the bottom was a folded piece of paper, heavier than the rest of the letter, cardstock, aged, creased from years of being folded. I opened it. It was a photograph. Small, taken on a film camera, the color slightly warm and faded the way photographs from the early 80s go. My mother, maybe 25, sitting at the end of the dock with a fishing rod she was clearly holding incorrectly, laughing at whoever was behind the camera. Beside her, 7 or 8 years old, was me and a child I barely recognized as myself, because I was laughing too, and the laughter on that child's face was so unguarded, so complete. So unaware of everything that was coming. On the back, in Walter's handwriting, "This is who you are when you are where you belong. Don't let anyone talk you out of knowing that." I sat on the kitchen floor. November light came through the window that faced the lake, and the wood stove, which I had apparently lit without quite registering that I was doing it, was beginning to push warmth into the room. Outside, the lake was going silver and dark in the early dusk. I stayed on the floor for a while. Then I got up and started looking around the cabin properly, not as a visitor, but as someone who was trying to understand what she had been given. Derek called on my second evening at the cabin. I knew he had found out. Frank had been professionally required to notify both parties of significant estate developments, and I had been expecting the call the way you expect weather you can see. Approaching from a distance. He opened without preamble, "Your lawyers should have disclosed the full estate assets. The summary forwarded to your counsel was accurate and complete," I said. "The land and investment account are separately titled assets. They were not concealed." A pause. "June." His tone shifted, the version of his voice that had always worked on me, the measured, reasonable register that made my concerns feel irrational. "I'm sure there's a way to handle this sensibly. We were married 11 years. I'm not trying to be adversarial. And here is the strange thing. Standing in that kitchen, with the lake outside the window and the coffee can of Leo's on the counter and 7 pages of Walter's handwriting in my jacket pocket, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Clear. I felt entirely, crystallinely clear. "Derek," I said, "you laughed. In that conference room, when you found out what I'd inherited. You laughed at a $7 cabin, and what you were actually laughing at was me. You were laughing at what you thought I was worth." Silence on the line. "My grandfather built something for me over 40 years, I said. He made contributions to an account every single month starting the year I was born. He structured property titles and worked with lawyers and wrote me a 7-page letter. He did all of that quietly, without telling me, without asking for acknowledgement, because that was the kind of love he had, the kind that works while you're not watching." I looked out at the lake. "You told me I'd get nothing," I said. "And I want you to understand that even if the cabin had genuinely been worth $7, you still would have been wrong. Because what I got was a place where I know who I am. And you have never, in 11 years, known what that's worth." He started to say something. I hung up. Then I stood at the window for a long time, watching the lake go dark, and I let myself feel every layer of the last 11 years, the good years early on, the slow erosion, the conference room. The drive north, the smell of the cabin, the photograph at the bottom of the coffee can. I let it all be true at once, the loss of it, the waste of it, and the fact that I was standing here. On 4 acres of lakefront land my grandfather had paid for with 60 years of early mornings and kept faith, and I was entirely, unambiguously okay. More than okay. I was starting. The divorce finalized on a Wednesday in February. I received the prenuptial settlement, the fixed sum Derek's lawyers had always planned on delivering, and I signed the documents and shook hands with my attorney. A sharp woman named Carol who had found genuine satisfaction in the preceding month's proceedings. I walked out of the building, got in my car, and drove 3 hours north. By spring, I had made a decision about the cabin that surprised almost everyone who heard it. Frank Heller had expected me to sell, the lakefront land alone would move quickly, and at $2.3 million I would be financially comfortable for a long time. Several developers had already made inquiries. Derek's lawyers had, through intermediaries, suggested that a quick sale might benefit everyone. I declined every offer. What I did instead was hire a structural engineer and a contractor from Millhaven who had grown up fishing this lake and knew it the way Walter had known it. We assessed the cabin's bones, which were, as it turned out, fundamentally sound under the weathered exterior, and we rebuilt outward from them. Kept the cast iron stove. Kept the 2 chairs that faced the lake. Kept the porch, rebuilt the sagging section, kept the same angle and the same proportions. I used a portion of Walter's investment account to build 3 additional small structures on the property, simple, well-built. Designed by a local architect who understood what the landscape required. I developed a small writer's retreat. For cabins total, the main one mine, 3 available for residency bookings, affordable rates specifically for writers, artists, academics. Anyone doing the kind of work that requires extended quiet. I started a waiting list within 6 weeks of announcing it. The list had 43 names within a month. I was not interested in becoming wealthy from the property. I was interested in building something that worked, that served a real function, that lasted, that meant something when you stood on the dock in the early morning and looked out at the water. Carol called me that summer to discuss some remaining financial paperwork, and at the end of the call, almost as an aside, she mentioned that Derek's new venture, a real estate development project he had invested heavily in, had encountered significant regulatory difficulties. I'm not glad, I told her. And I meant it. I was too busy to be glad about Derek's problems. I had a property to run, a waiting list to manage, and a dock to be on at 4:30 in the morning, in the particular silence before the lake woke up. Doing absolutely nothing and being entirely content. Walter would have approved. I still have the photograph. The one from the coffee can. It lives on the kitchen counter now, propped against the Lorcan that still sits in the same place it always did, because I saw no reason to move it. I look at that child sometimes. The one laughing on the dock with her mother, holding the fishing rod all wrong, with no idea what was coming. I don't feel sorry for her. She took the long way home. She made choices that cost her years and confidence and a specific quality of self-trust that had to be rebuilt slowly, the way the porch had to be rebuilt, from the sound bones out. But she got here. What I know now, living in this place that my grandfather spent 40 years quietly preparing for me, is that real love doesn't announce itself. It doesn't negotiate. It just works, steadily, without credit, in the direction of your future self. Walter never told me what he was building. He just kept building. That is the only inheritance that matters. Not the land. Not the account. The proof, which I carry with me every day, that someone saw who I was and never stopped believing I would find my way back to her. Find the people who build quietly for you. Be the person who builds quietly for someone else. The rest takes care of itself.